3, 2, 1.
It's an airplane that was designed as a fighter, came out in the war, but then it was already outclassed by some of the other airplanes that were flying. The gunner stands up front. He's barely protected by anything. I mean, this bit of fuselage only comes up to your kneecap. It's only a 70 or 80 mile an hour airplane. Very vulnerable because it wasn't able to maneuver. It's like flying a big truck, really.
Masterton's best known as a centre for the Wairarappa's agricultural industry, but it's also home to a unique historical collection, and I've come here to Hood Aerodrome to find out more.
Oh, there's about 26 airplanes here in the Vintage Aviator collection at Hood Aerodrome. We've been here for about 5 years. The oldest original airplane we have here at the Vintage Aviator is a BE-2F, an original RAF airplane that we've restored. We had to manufacture a completely new engine for it, but the airframe itself is mostly original. There's a lot of personality to each one. You know, you look at a strut like this is nearly 100 years old, it's original. The fabric is Irish linen, it's nice, it has a nice feel to it. When you look at the airplane itself, and if you look in the cockpit, it's extremely simple. There's not much to it. It's a very early design. You have to remember, at the beginning of the war, there weren't really fighters. They were just airplanes that could fly over the front lines, look down at the ground, and see where the other troops were, see where artillery was, and get that message back to their own front lines to, you know, counterattack and things like that.
And how do you get hold of something like that? I mean, does somebody just come along and say, do you want this aircraft?
One never knows. I mean, some of these things are tucked away in barns. Other ones, people have collected bits and pieces over the course of a lifetime, essentially. Other ones are traded through museums and things like that. We never know how an airplane's going to turn up or how we get a hold of one. You have to remember, aviation was quite new at the time. It's pretty much 10 years into its development. And they had the top minds and the top craftsmen in the world designing these airplanes and building them. So there's no end to the things that we find when we go to restore one of these airplanes. These designs were important to national security. This was what the country relied on to defend itself.
What is that leather strap doing on an aircraft?
Oh, yeah,
There's just a simple leather strap on an aircraft that was going up there and, well, you know, eventually being a fighter.
Yeah, I mean, it looks like somebody left the belt in the wrong place here, but the leather strap is just a safety device. I mean, there's a cowling here, a metal fairing that covers the fuel tank, and it's just a bit of safety so that this doesn't come ripping off.
The simplicity again.
Yeah, a lot of the stuff is just very primitive. Again, this engine is air-cooled. If you peek around here, these little vents that go into the crankcase of the engine, there's a lot of oil mist and stuff like that as the crankshaft turns around. Well, they're vented, and as the oil mist comes out of this tube, it blows past all those rocker arms and helps lubricate the engine. So, you know, it lubricates the engine and the gunner and the pilot and everything else. That's why that pair of goggles you're wearing and the nice scarf is really handy. I mean, it was something that you could wipe the goggles with. I mean, all these things had a purpose in these airplanes. It's a tremendous experience to fly an open cockpit airplane, period. You know, you're out there in the elements. It's like driving around in a convertible, essentially. You know, you fly down low over fields, you can smell the flowers, you can smell the sea air, that sort of thing. But to fly these really early airplanes, there's a whole nother dimension, particularly this Albatross. Behind the engine, most airplanes would have what's called a firewall. It's something that sort of blocks the engine from the pilot, a wee bit of protection. This airplane has nothing. The only thing between the engine and the pilot is essentially the fuel tank, which is probably not great either. But around the fuel tank, there's places where the air can slip through. And because the engine has all these exposed rockers, the cam gear that operate, you know, the valves, oil, grease, all of that comes back and hits the pilot in the face. And you can smell the exhaust. It's liquid cooled, and there's little drops of water that come back and hit you. When you first start the airplane up, the water expands a bit, and the radiator's mounted in the wing in this airplane. A little bit of that water comes back, and it's ice cold at the time. That gets you as well when you're first running it. And then a little later in the flight, the water is boiling hot, so now it's hitting you again, and it's blistering hot. Little bits of grease come back and hit you in the face. I mean, if you take a look at the windshield there on this airplane, you can see how filthy it is already. It's, that's one flight worth of dirt and grime. So
it's not much bigger than a sunglasses lens, is it?
No, these guys had a pretty tough job ahead of them. When you're flying these open cockpit airplanes over Europe during the war, some of these airplanes were flying as high as 10,000 feet. It's darn cold at that altitude in the summertime. Can you imagine how cold it is in the wintertime? The guys were bundled up. They had mittens to wear. They had boots. They had, fur-lined suits. Their helmets covered their whole face. There's stories where guys used whale blubber to cover exposed skin so they wouldn't get frostbite.
Really?
I mean, flying these airplanes at that altitude in the middle of winter in Europe wasn't very pleasant. They typically didn't have heaters. There were a few of them that had even had oxygen generators so the guys could breathe at those higher altitudes. That was much later in the war. They're not very comfortable. Again, cold, windy, noisy, not the place you'd want to be. Although considering the alternative, being down on the ground in the trenches with mustard gas and dysentery and the conditions that those guys faced down there, this was probably a much nicer alternative.
Now, we talked about the simplicity of how the aircraft works, but in terms of monitoring, nowadays we see commercial air pilots, going through checklists galore and flicking switches and pressing buttons. These guys had virtually nothing to do. Not much to do in there. You can look in this cockpit, very, very sparse. There's an altimeter here, a height gauge, and down on the floor there's a tachometer. It's very important to monitor the engine RPM. A lot of the engine manuals, like for the rotary engine on this airplane, there's always a warning that says do not exceed about 1,250 RPM, danger of rupture or bursting, because the engine was spinning. You didn't want to exceed that limit. That was not a good thing. There's another little device here called a pulsator. When the oil pump on this engine is in operation, this little bit of castor oil here sort of pulses up and down, and that's another way to monitor the engine. But again, very simple. There's one switch, on and off for the engine, pretty much, and that's about it. So there's not much for the pilot to monitor. And a lot of those extra little sort of niceties just added weight to these designs. Yeah. These very early airplanes were underpowered, and they were trying to get every bit of performance out of them, trying to get them to go as fast as they could, carry as much weight as they could. So adding stuff like that wasn't a real important option. But when it comes to these World War I airplanes, I'd have to say my favorite probably is the Sopwith Camel. Which is? Stand in the back, we'll take a look at it. The Sopwith Camel, I mean, growing up as a wee little boy, the stories made famous by Snoopy and the Red Baron, of course, involved the Sopwith Camel. They were really interesting, fun little stories. But after getting a chance to fly the Camel, I realized how important it was. It's very maneuverable. It's not very big, is it? No, not very big. It's an airplane that obviously is very famous, one of the best fighters of the First World War. It was known for its performance. The performance with the Sopwith Camel, it was sort of a double-edged sword. It had a very big rotary engine, so the engine spins with the propeller. But that large rotary engine created some problems. It has a lot of torque. And what happened was the airplane was quite dangerous to new pilots. So you take a young kid, 17, 18 years old, you learn to fly in an Avro, like this one over here, big long wings, long fuselage, very easy to control. Then you put him in a Sopwith Camel after he's only had 6 or 7 hours of flying, and this thing has short wings, 4 ailerons, very powerful engine, and a very short fuselage. Very touchy on the controls. The biggest problem was the engine. When you took off with this airplane, it always wanted to sort of roll to the right because of the torque of the engine. Mm-hmm. It would climb to the left, but making right turns, it would sort of dive and
go over on its back. So if you took off and mistakenly made a sharp right turn, the airplane would roll over on its back and pretty much go right into the ground. So there were reports saying more people were killed transitioning to the Sopwith Camel than were ever shot down in them. The era that these airplanes were designed in is really a crucial time for aviation. You know, in the very beginning, when airplanes first came to be, controls hadn't been decided on. In other words, today you have a control stick that sort of does the same thing in any airplane, or a control yoke in a modern airplane. But back in the day, in the early days of aviation, when you had airplanes that used wing warping, where you twisted the wing to get the airplane to roll or stuff, they had airplanes like Blérios and Hanrios, and they had all different manners of control. Some airplanes had the elevator control on a stick and the aileron control on another stick. You know, pedals that operated things like, you know, the rudder, or maybe even a brake on some of those early Curtiss designs, you know, just weird things. So when the First World War broke out, aircraft design started to become standardized. But yet, all of these airplanes have different personalities. The V12 engine in the Bristol fighter is delightful. It has a great sound. The Mercedes engine in the Albatross just instills confidence because it's a fantastic running engine. The rotary engine in the Sopwith Camel, just the way you throttle it, it has a selector magneto. The 160 Gnome doesn't have a normal throttle. The way it works is it has a selector that runs the engine at full speed, half speed, quarter speed, or turns it off completely. So it's an airplane where you're throttling it with the ignition system, which is really unique. So each of these airplanes has sort of unique little characteristics that make them extremely interesting to fly. But it's great flying all of them. I mean, you fly these BE-2s that have this air-cooled V8 engine, the RAF-1A engine, and when you read about it, everybody says how unreliable they were, how they overheated, how they broke down all the time. But I think people have to consider the time that these airplanes were operated in. You know, at the time, that BE-2 was a real workhorse. It did a job, and it did it well. So comparing it to a modern airplane is a bit unfair when you say, oh, the engine ran 50 hours and then they were overhauled. You know, 50 hours to these guys flying one of these airplanes during the Great War was a long time. You look at the average life of a fighter pilot, you know, they say that they had 6 hours of combat time was the lifespan of a pilot in the First World War. So, you know, an engine with 50 hours life was fantastic.